to you, who will be asking the really important asking the really important children, they're not here, asking the really important question of where are the children in the Iron Age and Viking Age burial record? Take a look.
Right. Good afternoon. To the disappointment of some and the relief of many, I won't be talking about posthumanism today. I will be asking the question, where are the children? Which I sadly don't have the answer right now. We're working on it. We are working on it. So today I'll be talking about a review, very brief because it's going to go on. A review of late Iron and Viking Age Scandinavian burial practices, finding children in the mortuary records, a bit of an overview of what we know so far, and then I'll be comparing two case study sites and making some initial observations. So the first thing to note is that the mortuary record and burial practices in Viking Age and Iron Age Scandinavia are defined by their multiplicity, diversity. There is no one set of burial typology criteria, which might be deemed universally characteristic or determinative or essential for a Viking grave. They vary between mounds, kists, coffins, earth cuts, boats, all different ways. They're arranged in numerous different ways, in cemeteries, in isolated burials. Graves are oriented and placed in different places. You have single interments, you have multiple interments, you have inclusions of various types of grave goods not at all, faunal inclusions, food items, and the variation is even hyperlocalized. So this isn't just between regions, but perhaps between settlements or even between farmsteads that we find variety. And this diversity has led to a deconstruction of the idea of a pan-Scandinavian society, the idea that Vikings weren't really a single homogeneous entity in any kind of way. But there are shared traits in grave typologies and material culture, and their presences and contradistinctions between burial practices in other contemporaneous cultures means that I think we can positively identify graves and say that they are deterministically Scandinavian, even outside of Scandinavia. And this complexity and variation allows us to pick apart the rich complexity of late Iron and Viking Age Scandinavian culture, practice and belief, and explore individuals' experiences, lifeways, and deathscapes. So the first question to ask then is, who was buried in Viking and late Iron Age Scandinavia? And pretty much the answer is not everyone got a burial or was afforded of any type. Perhaps as little as just over half were probably not buried at all. And a significant disparity exists between male and female sexed and gendered burials. Graves of adult males are overwhelmingly predominant, and children are even fewer. But why do these disparities occur? So these are being summarized by Ratican, preservation, which I'll move on to, excavations that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century, which are very problematic. Gendering by grave goods assemblage, which continued to be the predominant way that gendering and sexing occurred when studying Viking Age burials. Changing interpretations of artifacts over time, and as I've mentioned before, these massively divergent burial practices. I just want to point out here, there's two examples here of differences in preservation status. So this is a lovely pen and ink drawing of a burial from Birka, in which only the teeth were preserved. You can see there in the red circle. This one from Golgadil, you can see, is absolutely nigh on perfect condition of preservation. Again, more on this. But why were the previous suggestions that mortuary sex disparities resulted from males being dominant in certain spheres and females in others? I mean, this is deconstructed now, a lot of it, but it still continues to hold a lot of weight in some circles. Mariana Moen has argued that representation of males results more from the way that they're actually recovered and the way that we think about burial practices in the Viking Age, and has been discussed by Emma Thompson herself. Some of this is thought to have been underpinned by social status. We'll move on to what were burial trends and prominent rites. So the two most significant rites are cremations and inhumations. there's a heterogeneity of practices and assemblages, and this varies across space and time. They occur in single burials, cemeteries, as I've said before, and multiple burials is a very unique and challenging practice. It's common across the Western Viking world, and it's, as has been argued by Claire Rattigan, they brought together entangled assemblages, and they're used to articulate personhood of human and non-human entities and their connections across space and time, as in this lovely boat burial at Kolfang in Norway. And then towards the later Viking period, the influence of Christianity changes burial rites and practices again. So cremations were the most common rite. There's a sort of outline there of how they were done. Burials sometimes dug into pyres and then collected and sorted, sometimes put in vessels, and the grave goods were often included on these pyres in these burials. This is Mound 50 from Heathwood in Derbyshire, a really interesting burial. Sadly, don't have that much time to talk about it today, but it shows evidence of Viking migration into England and also children amongst settlers in the Great Army during the late 9th century. Inhumation was the less common rite. Bodies were typically laid in grave cuts. These included all the kinds of things, coffins, but other materials as well. They were mostly supine on the side, laid on the side. We do find prone burials, particularly in Gotland. It seems to be practiced a lot on the island of Gotland, which is to the east of Sweden. Grave goods typically match or exceed cremation burials. There's an and then as here you can see, there's this interesting association with means of transport. So this is the famous VJ581 from Birka with horses, but this is also a kist burial. That's the Oseberg ship from Norway. And then this is a photo I took of a burial in the Isle of Man this year. And this has been suggested that possibly believe that the dead were on journeys to other places. Quickly on regional variations, Denmark, in contrast to the other areas of Scandinavia, retained inhumation into the Viking Age as the dominant rite, whereas Sweden and Norway, cremation was dominant. We do find in both regions interesting unique types, such as the Valtgärde and the Vendel burials. Time. Moving quickly on to child mortality. So the major challenge in investigating childhood in late Iron and Viking Age Scandinavia is significant underrepresentation of children in the burial record. But paradoxically, it's thought that there was a high child mortality rate, perhaps 30 to 60%. This was heightened in early years, so children are most likely to die in infancy. It's the dilemma, but mortality rate for children in pre-industrial societies under 10 years was also really high, about 34%, and it's been suggested that there's very little reason to disregard this as being also true in the Viking Age. But if so many children were dying in the Viking Age, why can't we find them in the burial record? So where are children? It's estimated women in Viking Age Scandinavia gave birth every 33 months. And this might have been actually shortened period due to climatic and various other conditions in Scandinavia. Demographically, it's been suggested that parents might have raised 2.25 children. I don't know what they're doing with the other quarter, but go back. So if these figures are true, there must have been lots and lots of children, both living and dying in Scandinavia, but they make up just less than 15% in Danish Viking skeletal collections, and it might be as low as 6% across the whole corpus. These are quite old statistics, and it'd be nice if someone would do some new ones. So someone wants to give me a postdoc. Possible causes: non-adult burials and skeletal remains not surviving due to factors affecting preservation, recovery, and identification. Children could have been buried differently in non-cemetery contexts and in archaeologically invisible ways, or perhaps not even at all. Or was it something else? Is there infanticide going on? Is there sacrifice? Children as non-social persons and therefore not receiving typical mortuary treatments, or are they being treated as body objects? I'm basing a lot of my methodology and design on some very interesting work that's come out quite recently from contemporaneous cemeteries rather, in Latvia. And I had to have a go at that name, I'm really sorry. But she has come up with very similar arguments and has come up with some very interesting results. So is it just that children are not being preserved? So the underrepresentation might be resulting from intrinsic and extrinsic taphonomic and cultural factors. So the intrinsic factors would be things like the physiochemical properties of bone. That's how they're made up and what they're constituted of. Bone type and size and pathological conditions and injuries. These can all affect how bone survives once it's been buried. The effects of groundwater, temperature, soil, and pH values, particularly acidic soils are more damaging, and neutral and alkali pH values tend to be better. Then you've got damage and destruction by flora and fauna. So that's plants and animals getting into burials and disrupting the pattern. And then there's human agency. So human-related extrinsic factors include archaeologists' failure to recognize and recover skeletal remains effectively, but also contemporaneous treatment of bodies after death and burial and different types thereof, and also secondary burials, people removing the original interments or adding new people in, which disrupts the original pattern and causes bones to be lost. And then there's grave depth and size, which is also being hypothesized to affect preservation. So moving on to a little bit of my research. My research is mostly concentrating on materials from Sweden and Denmark, but I will also be looking at other areas of the Viking diaspora. This was my original long list, and it's getting whittled down steadily. So these are some of the sites that I will be looking at. But today I'm going to talk about two sites in particular, and that's Birka and Fjälkinge, and they're both in Sweden. But Birka is a significant proto-urban settlement in eastern Sweden. It's on an island called Birka, and it's was a major centre during the Viking Age. It's also the largest Viking cemetery ever found, about 3,000 burials, which 1,100 roughly have been excavated, but that was during the late 19th century with some very, very questionable excavation techniques. Of the just over 1,100 excavated burials, 504 inhumations, 570 cremations, but the preservation of human remains in both these types of burials is generally really poor. And this means that we can't really identify sex, age, pathologies, all these kinds of things that we're really interested in finding out. And to add insult to injury, since the excavation, the human remains have been relocated and the materials have been mixed, and the context have become very confused. Having just been to Sweden to look at them, it's an absolute car crash, and it's really, really sad. You find animal bones in bags that should be children. You find all sorts of stuff. It's awful. But the demographic estimations from Birka suggest that there are predominantly women amongst the population there, but there were 91 child inhumation. Although, again, there's some issues here with methodology, as Ann-Sophie Gosselin has suggested that grave length and the goods involved might be, through that we might be able to determine that more graves belong to children, even when there are no skeletal remains. I'm not entirely convinced, but it was an interesting idea in the 70s. Half of the children at Birka died before they were 10. So this again adds to that some of the problems with intrinsic and extrinsic taphonomic factors. And there's been further demographic estimates from sample populations studied more recently. They found that 10% of, in Anna Schildström's case, there were 10% of her sample within the 20 and 13% of juveniles in the Rice paper. But why are there so few children here? Is it because of those preservation factors, or is it something else? This is not a typical Viking cemetery. It's a mercantile and proto-urban site, and it could be that people are just not bringing their children to Birka, or raising them there, or choosing not to bury them there. This brings us on to the second case study site, which is Fjälkinga. Fjälkinga is right down here in Skåne, in the south of Sweden. It's dated to 900 to 1050 CE. So that crosses into the Christianization period. So there's some really interesting transitional burial rites going on. It was a rescue excavation carried out in the 1990s, and they uncovered 121 graves in an area of about 7,000 hectares. From those burials, there were 128 individuals, and of those, a staggering 80 were children. There's 24 men and 24 women. All the skeletons were unburnt and really well preserved. There's an that bit there just talks about some of the way that they're oriented in grave goods, which reveals about the transition between the two burial rites, from pagan or pre-Christian to Christian. And just to highlight as well, these massively aberrant age distributions and demographics that we find in Fjälkinga. It's dominated not only by children, but by young children. And there's about 81.2% of the children were under 1 year of the Fjälkinga cemetery. Not only are there so many children's burials, but they're also quite interesting. Apologies, I should have said there are human remains warning before, but yeah, there is. A bit late now. There are some very interesting children's burials at Berka. We find in more than one instance, we find these multiple burials of children where a younger child and a slightly older child are buried together in this sort of like closeness, almost pairing position. There's also a really interesting multi-layered burial in which there is a child on the bottom layer, slightly older child slightly in the layer above, and then on top of them is a dog and a puppy. It's capped off. But in spite of all this, and then no matter how fascinating Fjälkinga is, the area of the site that has been excavated is thought to be only a fraction of the total cemetery. So those exciting statistics might only be part of the story. And we might actually only be looking at 5 to 10% of the total population. That could be somewhere comparable to Berka, where we're looking at, I mean, 11, like nearly, 2,500 individuals. So the demographics could look very different if this site were to be fully excavated. To finish up, the late Iron and Viking Age burials in Scandinavia, very varied practices, vary across time and space. But incidences of child burials do not match up the child mortality rates. Factors affecting preservation may have a part to play here, but even at other sites where skeletal preservation is good, children only make up a small fraction of the cemetery population, such as at Golgadil in Denmark, where they're just 16% of the cemetery population. So I think there is something else going on here, and that is that children were being subjected to different burial practices to adults. So the next steps in my research are going to be exploring different types of child burial rites and their occurrence or absence within the mortuary record, comparison between more normative and atypical burial rites, as well as defining what those terms mean, examination of spatial distribution in grave goods, and utilizing all of the above to explore differences in experience and conceptions concerning children and childhood, gender and social status, and life course progressions. And this will be complemented by some bioarchaeology, which I'll present. Thank you. To be continued. I also want to go really fast because then you
have 2 minutes. So I was wondering, did you want to talk about weaning?
Oh, the weanling dilemma. So that's the suggestion that as infants transition from purely breastfeeding onto substitute foods, that they're at risk of losing immunity and from another, and also being exposed to pathogens by the food that they eat. But this is being debunked, and we're only really beginning to scratch the surface of applying current clinical research to studies of weaning and breastfeeding pathogens. In the present, it's past. That's a very succinct description of where we're at with the weaning dilemma. I've filled my time. I am relieved.
Wait, give another round of applause.